My name is Emma. I'm 34 years old. And for 20 years my family called me the sick one. The one who wasn't as smart as my twin sister, the one who cost too much, the one who wasn't worth the investment. They stopped inviting me to holidays. They stopped answering my calls. My own mother once told me in front of my sister Madison that some children are just built for success and some are built for hospital bills. But last Thanksgiving I sat back down at that table. And when I laid a napkin next to my sister's plate, one folded around a single piece of paper, the entire room went silent. By the end of this story you'll understand why my mother dropped her wine glass. Why my father couldn't look at me. And why, 20 years after they walked away from my hospital bed, they were the ones begging for a seat at mine. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay to the end. This one's for you. To understand why that napkin mattered, you need to understand what it was like growing up as the other twin. Madison and I were born 11 minutes apart. He came first, healthy, screaming, perfect. I came second, tangled in complications the doctors never fully explained to us, not even years later. What I did know was this. I spent my childhood in and out of hospitals for a chronic illness that never had a clean name, just a rotating cast of specialists and a filing cabinet of test results nobody wanted to talk about at dinner. Madison never had a single sick day worth mentioning. By the time we were 10, the pattern was already set in stone. Madison got straight A's without trying. I got B's while missing 40 days of school a year for treatments. Madison got piano lessons, gymnastics, a birthday party every single year with a bounce house and a guest list. I got a get-well balloon from the hospital gift shop and a mother who checked her watch during visiting hours like she had somewhere better to be. My father, Richard, worked long hours running a mid-sized logistics company he'd built from nothing. My mother, Diane, ran the house, and ran it, I would later realize, like a business with two very different assets. One asset appreciated. One asset drained the account. Madison's going to do something extraordinary, my mother used to say, usually within earshot of me, as if repetition might will it into truth faster. She's got the drive. She's got the mind for it. Nobody ever finished the sentence about what I had. By high school the gap wasn't subtle anymore. Madison was student council president, valedictorian track, already fielding scholarship offers from 3 universities before she'd even applied. I was the twin sister people vaguely remembered existing. Oh, right, Madison has a sister. Usually followed by an awkward pause once they found out why I wasn't in the yearbook photos that year. My parents paid for Madison's SAT prep courses. Private tutors. A car for her 17th birthday, brand new, red bow and everything, parked in the driveway like something out of a commercial. For my 17th birthday I got a card. My mother forgot to sign it. I want to be clear about something because I know how this sounds. I didn't hate my sister. Madison didn't ask for the favoritism any more than I asked for the illness. We were just 2 little girls born into a house where love had apparently been rationed, and somebody decided I'd get the smaller portion. What I did resent even as a kid was the language. The way my own parents talked about me like I was a liability on a spreadsheet. Not as smart. Not built like Madison. We have to be realistic about where we invest our energy. I heard variations of that sentence more times than I can count, usually said softly like it was some kind of mercy to be honest about it. By the time I was 22, the divide had calcified into something permanent. Madison graduated with honors, landed a job at a firm that mattered, got engaged to a man named Drew who fit seamlessly into my parents' vision of what a son-in-law should look like. Photos went up all over the house. Announcements went out to the extended family. My mother cried actual tears of pride at that engagement dinner. Tears I never once saw her shed for anything that happened to me. I was working part-time at a bookstore, managing my health as best I could without insurance that actually covered what I needed, and slowly accepting that I'd become a background character in my own family's story. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself I'd built a life outside of them. Modest but mine. A small apartment. A handful of real friends. A version of peace. I didn't know yet that the real test of this family wasn't going to be about me at all. It was going to be about my father. And what happened to him would either break this family completely, or finally show every one of us exactly who we really were. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March 3 years ago. I was restocking a shelf at the bookstore when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was a nurse from Ridgemont General. My father had collapsed at his office. Cardiac event. They were running tests, but it wasn't good. His kidneys were failing along with his heart, and they needed family at the hospital immediately. I dropped everything and drove straight there, my hands shaking on the wheel the entire way. Whatever else had happened between us, he was still my father. I still loved him, even after years of watching him stand silently beside my mother while she decided I wasn't worth much. When I got to the hospital, the waiting room was already full. My mother, Diane, sat rigid in a chair, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue for an audience that wasn't there. Madison was pacing, phone pressed to her ear, already fielding calls from Drew and coordinating who needed to be told what. It looked less like a family in crisis and more like a campaign war room. I walked up to my mother first. "How is he? What are they saying?" She looked at me like I'd interrupted something. "Emma, I didn't realize anyone called you. Not, 'I'm glad you're here.' Not, 'He's asking for you.' Just confusion that I'd shown up at all. Like grief was a resource reserved for people who'd earned it." A doctor came out 20 minutes later to update the family. He looked at the three of you and asked, "Are you all his immediate family?" "Yes," my mother said before I could open my mouth. "My daughter Madison and myself. We're his immediate family." I stood there, close enough to touch, and she erased me in a single sentence. The doctor, confused, glanced at me. "And you are?" "His other daughter," I said quietly. My mother's jaw tightened, but she didn't correct herself. The doctor, sensing tension he didn't understand, addressed his update mostly to her and Madison. "Multi-organ complications. A likely need for dialysis. Possibly, eventually, a transplant depending on how his kidneys responded over the coming weeks." I asked if I could see him. My mother said the doctors wanted to limit visitors to reduce stress on his system. Just for now, just the two of us, since we're the ones coordinating his care. I believed her. That's the humiliating part. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours waiting for my turn, while Madison went in twice and my mother went in 3 times, each visit longer than the last. When I finally asked a nurse directly whether visitor restrictions were actually in place, she looked confused and said no. Patients in his ward could have visitors any time within visiting hours, no special limit. There had never been a restriction. My mother had simply decided I wasn't on the list. I didn't make a scene. I've had 20 years of practice not making scenes. I just sat there, feeling something in me go quiet and cold in a way it hadn't before. Not hurt exactly, but recognition. A confirmation of something I think I'd always known but had never let myself say out loud. To this family, I wasn't just less loved. I was optional. I finally saw my father around 10 that night, after Madison had gone home to sleep and my mother had stepped out for coffee. He was pale, tubes running into both arms, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. "Emma," he said, voice cracked and small. "You came." "Of course I came, Dad." He reached for my hand and for a moment, it felt like maybe this was the crack in the wall. The moment where 20 years of distance might finally start to close. I had no idea that within days, this hospital room would become the site of the family's next battle. Because as his kidneys continued to fail, one word started circulating through every hushed conversation in that waiting room. Donor. And when that word landed, it would reveal exactly how far my mother was willing to go to make sure I never got the one thing I'd always wanted from this family. A chance to matter. Within a week, my father's kidney function had dropped low enough that his medical team began the transplant conversation in earnest. Dialysis could buy time, but his doctor was blunt. At his age, with his other complications, a living donor was his best shot at a real recovery. That's when the family meeting got called. My mother organized it like she organized everything. A formal sit-down at the house, seating arranged, an agenda nobody admitted to but everyone seemed to already know. Madison was there with Drew. I came alone, still not fully understanding why this required a meeting instead of a simple conversation between adults who loved my father. My mother opened by explaining the situation as if we hadn't all just lived through the hospital ourselves. Then she said the part that mattered. The transplant team wanted to test immediate family members for compatibility, starting with Madison and me since siblings, especially twins, often made the strongest matches. I said I'd get tested immediately. Of course I would. He was my father too. That's when my mother's expression changed. Emma, I don't think that's necessary, she said carefully. Madison's already agreed to get tested. Let's not put you through something so invasive, given everything you're already managing health-wise. Sounded like concern. It wasn't. Mom, I want to get tested. If I'm a match, I want the option. There's no reason for both of you to go through the testing process, she said, her voice sharpening now that the pleasant mask had slipped. Frankly, Emma, given your medical history, I'm not sure you'd even be cleared as a viable donor. We don't want to raise false hope. I looked at my father, hoping he'd say something. He looked exhausted, caught between two daughters and a wife who'd spent 2 decades deciding which daughter's voice counted. Diane, he said quietly, let both girls get tested. What's the harm? My mother's jaw tightened the same way it had in that hospital waiting room. The harm, Richard, is putting Emma's already fragile health at further risk for a procedure she's unlikely to qualify for anyway. Madison is healthy. Madison is the logical candidate. I don't understand why we're even debating this. Madison, to her credit, didn't say much during this exchange. She sat there twisting the ring on her finger, glancing between our mother and me like she wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. I want to get tested, I repeated, quieter now because I could feel the room tilting against me the way it always had. Even if I'm not a match, I want to know I tried. My mother stood up, signaling the meeting was over in the way she always did, not with words but with movement. I'll schedule Madison's testing with Dr. Patel this week. Emma, if you truly insist, you can call and arrange your own appointment. I'm not going to fight you on it, but I want it on record that I think this is unnecessary and potentially harmful to you. On record. Like she was building a case file instead of talking about her husband's life. I called Dr. Patel's office myself the next morning and scheduled my own testing, paying out of pocket for anything my thin insurance wouldn't cover, because I refused to let my mother's narrative be the only one that existed. The nurse on the phone was kind, professional, and mentioned, almost in passing, that my mother's office had already called twice that week, asking pointed questions about whether sibling donor testing could be streamlined to just one candidate to save time and hospital resources. I hadn't even had my blood drawn yet, and my mother was already trying to make sure I wasn't in the running. The testing itself took 2 weeks. Blood work, imaging, a full evaluation of kidney function and overall health clearance. I tried not to think about it too much while I waited, tried not to let myself hope, because hope had never been a currency this family paid out to me. But when the results came back, they confirmed something none of us expected. I was a match. A strong one. Stronger, according to Dr. Patel, than what they'd found with Madison's initial screening. And when my mother found out, her reaction wasn't relief. It was something closer to panic. My mother's panic didn't last long. Within days she'd pivoted, and Madison, surprisingly, was the one who found the angle. If Emma's donating, Madison said at a follow-up family dinner, people should know. This is actually a beautiful story. A sick twin saving her father's life. We could turn this into something positive. Maybe even raise money for Dad's recovery costs, the parts insurance won't cover. Sounded generous. I wanted to believe it was. Madison set up an online fundraiser that same week, titled Saving Our Father, A Family's Journey. She wrote the copy herself, heartfelt, detailed, emotional. She used a photo of the three of us from years earlier before things had fractured. I should have paid closer attention to the wording. The page mentioned our family's sacrifice. It mentioned the strength it takes to give this gift. It never once used my name. When I asked about it, Madison waved me off. It's easier to keep it general. Less complicated legally, less pressure on you specifically. I'm just trying to protect your privacy. I believed her. I wanted to. The fundraiser launched on a Friday. By Monday it had raised $12,000. By Wednesday, Madison had done her first interview about it, for a local morning show segment on families supporting sick parents. I wasn't invited to be on camera. I told myself it didn't matter. The money was for Dad. That was the point. I didn't yet understand whose name would end up attached to all of it. Surgery day arrived fast. I remember the fluorescent lights of the pre-op room, the nurse marking my side with a marker, my mother nowhere in sight until minutes before they wheeled me back. "You're doing a good thing," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. It was the closest thing to affection she'd offered me in years. I woke up hours later in a recovery room alone. No family in the chair beside me. No flowers. Just a nurse checking my vitals and a whiteboard with my discharge instructions. Madison and my mother, I later learned, had spent the day in my father's room down the hall, celebrating as his numbers improved. Nobody checked on me until visiting hours were almost over. When my mother finally appeared, she stayed 4 minutes. Long enough to ask if I was doing okay, short enough that she was gone before I finished answering. I lay there that night, one kidney lighter, wondering if I'd just given away a piece of my body to people who wouldn't give me 4 honest minutes in return. Recovery was brutal and I faced most of it alone. I lived by myself, which meant grocery runs, medication schedules, and wound care fell entirely on me, some days moving from bed to bathroom like it was a marathon. The bookstore couldn't hold my part-time position indefinitely. No insurance meant no paid leave, and 6 weeks without income meant my savings, thin to begin with, evaporated fast. I fell behind on rent. I sold furniture I couldn't really spare just to cover the gap. I called my mother once, during the worst of it, and asked if the family could help cover a portion of my medical bills, since I'd just given a kidney to keep the family patriarch alive. She sighed like I'd asked for something outrageous. "Emma, we already have Dad's expenses. The fundraiser covered a lot of that. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do." I hung up and cried for the first time since the surgery. Not from pain. From the math of it. 1 kidney given, $0 returned. 3 months after my surgery, I saw it on Instagram. A photo of Madison in a navy blue gown, standing at a podium at some downtown hotel ballroom, under a banner that read, "The Madison Foundation, Family, Health and Hope." The caption described how Madison had led her family through the darkest chapter of their lives, organizing donor testing, coordinating care, and raising over $40,000 for her father's recovery. 40,000. Not 12. It had grown. The local news article, which I found through a tagged comment, called Madison an inspiration, detailing how she turned her family's crisis into a registered nonprofit. One that, buried in paragraph 9, mentioned tax-deductible donations and an upcoming 501c3 filing. There was no mention of a donor surgery. No mention of a kidney. No mention of me. I scrolled through 40 comments calling Madison a hero before I closed the app, my hands cold, my chest tight with something I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't just that I'd been erased. It was that my body, my sacrifice, had apparently become raw material for someone else's foundation. Which brings us back to that Thanksgiving table. I almost didn't go. But something in me needed to sit across from these people one more time, needed to watch them closely, needed answers I couldn't get over the phone. Dinner went the way it always did. Madison at the center, my mother beaming at her, my father quieter than usual, glancing at me with something like guilt he never voiced. Then Madison stood, wine glass in hand, and gave a toast about family sacrifice, about the strength it took to save Dad, about how proud she was of everything we built together this year. Everyone raised their glasses. I didn't. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded napkin, the same kind from the hospital cafeteria, the one I'd kept since the day of my surgery. Inside it was a printed page. I set it beside Madison's plate and said quietly, "Before we toast anything else, I think everyone should read this." My mother's smile faltered. Madison's hand froze around her glass. I hadn't said what it was yet. I didn't need to. The napkin held a single page, a printed summary from a meeting I'd had 2 weeks earlier with an attorney named Marissa Walsh. I'd hired her after a friend suggested I look into the fundraiser's finances, given how the numbers kept shifting in public posts. What Walsh found after pulling public nonprofit filings and payment records went far beyond a discrepancy. The Madison Foundation had never sent a cent to my father's hospital directly. Instead, funds had been routed through Madison's personal business account before being redistributed. A portion to a medical consulting fee paid to Madison herself, a portion to administrative costs, and a smaller remainder eventually forwarded to my parents. Of the reported $40,000 raised, barely $9,000 had ever reached an actual medical bill. Walsh's report also flagged something else. Madison had filed the foundation's paperwork listing herself as the sole donor coordinator, formally documenting in writing that she had facilitated and undergone medical testing in service of her father's transplant. Not tested. Not undergone. I had undergone the testing. I had undergone the surgery. Madison's own kidney had never left her body. She'd built a nonprofit, a press narrative, and a tax write-off on the back of a surgery she never had. I set the napkin down and watched my mother's face as she read it, watched the exact moment the color left her cheeks. "This is a full accounting," I said calmly. "Every transfer. Every filing. Every dollar. I have copies for everyone at this table." The table went silent except for the sound of paper being unfolded. My father read it first, his hands trembling slightly as his eyes moved down the page. When he finished, he looked at Madison and I watched 2 decades of blind faith crack in real time. "Is this true?" he asked her, voice barely above a whisper. Madison's face had gone white. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. The consulting fee was standard practice, nonprofits do that. I was going to." "You told everyone you got tested," I said. "You told a reporter you helped save Dad's life. You let people believe it was you on that operating table." "I never said that exactly," Madison stammered. "You never corrected it either," I said. Drew, sitting beside her, had gone quiet, his eyes fixed somewhere on the tablecloth, clearly hearing pieces of this for the first time. My mother finally spoke, and it wasn't the apology I might have once hoped for. "Emma, this isn't the time or place," she snapped. "You could have brought this to us privately instead of ambushing your sister at Thanksgiving." "I tried private conversations for 20 years, Mom," I said. "Nobody ever listened." My father set the napkin down and looked at my mother with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Not anger exactly, but something like recognition, the same recognition I'd felt in that hospital waiting room months earlier. "Diane," he said slowly, "did you know about this?" My mother didn't answer right away. That silence told him everything he needed to know. What came out over the following days was worse than any of us expected. My father, shaken, asked Walsh to expand her review, not just the foundation's finances, but the medical paperwork surrounding the transplant itself. Walsh requested records from the hospital's donor coordination office, standard procedure for verifying informed consent documentation. Buried in the file was something none of us had known. 2 weeks before my surgery, my mother had contacted the transplant office directly, requesting a review of my medical suitability, citing concerns about my chronic condition that she claimed my own doctors hadn't properly disclosed. The hospital's ethics coordinator had taken the concerns seriously enough to briefly pause my case pending an internal review. A delay of 9 days that I'd been told at the time was a routine scheduling issue. It hadn't been routine. My mother had tried quietly and formally to get me disqualified as a donor. Not because she doubted my health. Dr. Patel's notes, included in the file, stated plainly that my mother's claims didn't match my actual medical history and were ultimately dismissed as unsubstantiated. She hadn't been protecting me from a risky procedure. She'd been trying to stop me from being the daughter who saved him. I sat with that file in my hands for a long time before I could speak. 20 years of hearing I wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worth the investment. And when I finally had the chance to prove otherwise, in the most literal physical way a person can prove their worth to a parent, my own mother had tried to take even that away from me. Walsh's findings didn't stay contained to our family. The Madison Foundation had an actual board, 3 local business contacts Madison had recruited for credibility, and Walsh's documentation of misused donor funds triggered a mandatory review. I attended at Walsh's advice as a documented witness and the actual donor of record. Madison sat across the table, composure cracking as the board treasurer read through the discrepancies line by line. The consulting fees, the misrepresented donor claims, the mismatch between reported and actual medical expenses covered. Ms. Madison, the board chair said finally, did you undergo a kidney donation procedure as documented in our public filings? The silence stretched long enough to answer the question itself. No, Madison finally said, barely audible. And the funds labeled as medical consulting fees paid to yourself? I can explain the accounting. We'd like an explanation in writing, along with immediate suspension of your director role pending a full compliance audit. I watched my sister, the golden child, the one who never had to explain herself to anyone, sit in a room full of people finally asking her to. The fallout rippled outward for months. My parents separated within the year. My father, for the first time in decades, said he couldn't stay married to someone who'd tried to stop his own daughter from saving his life. My mother moved into a small condo across town, and our relationship, already thin, went quiet altogether. Madison lost her board position and eventually her marriage. Drew filed for divorce 6 months later, citing trust issues that had started long before Thanksgiving. He called me once nearly a year after that dinner. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I just needed you to know I know what I did. I told her I appreciated the call. I didn't tell her I forgave her because I wasn't ready to. And I've learned I don't owe anyone that timeline anymore. My father and I talk every week now. It's not everything I lost, but it's real. 20 years they told me I wasn't enough. It took one napkin to show them who actually was. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. There's another one waiting next week, just as raw, just as real. And if anyone's ever made you feel like the lesser one in your own family, comment below. I read every single one. You're not who they said you were. You never were.